She arrived at the naval base early in the morning, the sun barely spilling light across the vast compound. The gates opened slowly, and as she stepped through, a sense of purpose carried her forward. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't there to follow orders blindly or to blend in with the crowd. Every movement she made showed a quiet confidence, a kind of calm that drew attention without her even trying. People couldn't help but notice her. Her uniform was neat, her boots polished, but what really caught the eyes of the soldiers around her was the tattoo on her forearm. It wasn't a small, casual design. This tattoo told a story, though few could understand it. Lines, symbols, and intricate patterns covered her arm, seeming almost alive under the bright morning sun. To the casual observer, it looked unusual, maybe even eccentric. Some soldiers glanced at each other and stifled laughs. "Who does she think she is?" one muttered quietly, trying to hide the smirk on his face. Another whispered, "That tattoo looks like some kind of joke." She heard none of it. In fact, she didn't even seem to notice. She walked with her head held high, her eyes scanning the base ahead, taking in the sights, the tall metal fences, the rows of buildings, the vehicles lined up perfectly, and the distant hum of machinery. It was a place where discipline mattered more than anything else. And yet, here she was, entering with an air that made the air itself feel different. There was something about her presence that seemed to challenge the ordinary, even without a single word spoken. The soldiers who had mocked her tattoo were confused by their own reactions. They were used to newcomers who either blended in or tried too hard to fit. But she didn't need to fit. There was no hesitation in her step, no nervous glance, nothing that screamed, "I'm trying to impress you." Her tattoo, they realized slowly, was more than just decoration. It was a symbol of something deeper, something personal and significant. But what it meant, they could only guess. As she moved through the compound, she passed by clusters of soldiers talking and laughing. Some of them stopped mid-conversation to look, their curiosity piqued. There was a murmur, a low buzz of whispers that spread quietly across the base. "Who is she?" someone asked. "Does anyone know her?" Another shook his head, replying, "I've never seen her before. That tattoo. It's weird." Even though the comments were meant to be dismissive, there was an unspoken tension in the air. People were drawn to her, almost like her confidence pulled their eyes toward her, demanding attention whether they wanted it or not. Inside, she felt a mix of anticipation and calm. She had been here before in situations far more dangerous than this, but nothing could diminish the feeling that today mattered. Every step she took was deliberate. Every glance she cast across the base was careful, observing her surroundings. She noticed how the guards at the checkpoint kept a subtle distance, how the junior officers exchanged uneasy glances. None of them knew her story. None of them understood what the tattoo really meant. And that was exactly how it was supposed to be. The morning light caught her tattoo in a way that almost made it glow. Soldiers who had been laughing just moments before now paused, squinting to make sense of the symbols etched into her skin. There was a complexity to it that suggested experience, sacrifice, and history. Even those who were skeptical couldn't shake a creeping curiosity. What was the story behind it? Why would someone carry such a design with such pride? Her presence on the base was a quiet challenge to the assumptions everyone had. People saw her tattoo and immediately judged, thinking it was just a mark of rebellion or eccentricity. But those who judged so quickly didn't know that every line and curve represented a journey, a series of events that only a few people in the world could truly understand. They didn't know that this was the mark of someone who had been through unimaginable experiences, someone who had faced danger and come out alive. Not by luck, but by skill, determination, and sheer courage. She walked past the main gate and into the heart of the base. The murmur of whispers followed her, but she remained unaffected. In a way, she almost welcomed it. Let them doubt. Let them laugh. She didn't need approval. In fact, the more they mocked her tattoo, the more she knew that one day, they would understand its meaning. And when that moment came, there would be no need for words. The story behind her tattoo would speak for itself, louder than any laughter or whisper could. By the time she reached the assembly area, the soldiers' curiosity had reached its peak. Eyes followed her every step, some filled with doubt, some with admiration they didn't dare admit. But she kept walking, steady and composed, carrying the silent weight of her past with her. The tattoo on her arm was no longer just an image. It was a signal, a promise, a history that demanded respect even before anyone knew its full story. And so, she stood there at the center of the naval base, a figure of quiet power. The morning sun glinted off her uniform and tattoo alike, illuminating a truth that most had yet to realize. This was someone extraordinary, and nothing, mockery, doubt, or whispers, could ever change that. By midday, the whispers had grown louder, and the casual glances had turned into pointed stares. Her arrival had unsettled the base in a way she had anticipated. The soldiers who had laughed at her tattoo earlier were now openly talking about it. Some tried to make jokes, nudging each other and muttering phrases meant to mock her. "Look at that thing," one soldier said with a smirk. "She's wearing it like it's a badge of honor." Another chuckled nervously and added, "I've never seen anything like it. Does she think it makes her important?" She walked past them without breaking her stride. Her face showed nothing but calm, yet her mind observed everything. She noticed the way some soldiers tried to hide their curiosity behind laughter, how others pretended not to look, and how a few simply stared, unable to hide their intrigue. In their eyes, she was a puzzle, a riddle that didn't fit the neat order of the base. And she liked it that way. The tattoo on her arm was the reason for all this attention. To outsiders, it might have seemed strange, maybe even rebellious, but to her it was much more. Each line, each symbol, each intricate detail was a story of past missions, challenges she had faced, and promises she had kept. It was a silent record of her life, etched permanently on her skin, and only a few people in the world could truly read it. Some of the junior officers couldn't resist making snide comments. "Does she really think she belongs here?" one whispered under his breath. "That tattoo makes her look like she's pretending to be something she's not," another added. Laughter followed, but it was uneven, forced. No one could quite shake the feeling that she wasn't just another soldier trying to prove herself. There was something about her presence, something in the way she carried herself, that demanded a level of attention beyond mere mockery. Despite the ridicule, she didn't flinch. In fact, she welcomed it. Let them doubt. Let them whisper. She had faced far greater challenges than this. There had been moments in her past where every step could have been her last, where judgment and doubt weren't just words but matters of life and death. Compared to those times, this mockery was insignificant. Her tattoo, which they thought was odd or meaningless, was actually her armor. It reminded her of who she was, what she had accomplished, and why she deserved to be here. The base seemed to shift subtly around her as she moved. Conversations paused when she walked by, as if people sensed her confidence and instinctively gave her space. Those who had laughed earlier now found themselves second-guessing their assumptions. There was an undeniable aura about her, a quiet strength that made it impossible to dismiss her as just another newcomer. Every step she took seemed deliberate, measured, almost like a dance choreographed by years of discipline and experience. As the morning moved into afternoon, a few curious soldiers began to approach her, asking casual questions, trying to understand who she was. She answered politely but didn't reveal too much. She didn't need to. Her story was written on her skin, visible to those who could recognize it, but invisible to those who only saw what they wanted to see. The tattoo was a filter, separating those who judged blindly from those who were perceptive enough to see the truth. Some tried to engage her with humor, pointing at her tattoo and asking if it had a hidden meaning. She smiled faintly, an expression that was neither amused nor annoyed. It was a smile that said, without words, "You have no idea." That alone unsettled them further. They had thought the tattoo was a joke, a way to draw attention, but there was a quiet confidence behind her gaze that made it clear. The tattoo was far more significant than they could imagine. The more she moved through the base, the more attention she drew. Soldiers whispered to each other, trying to piece together who she was, and why her tattoo seemed so important. The junior officers who had mocked her were now unsure, glancing nervously as if worried they might have insulted someone far more experienced than they realized. For them, curiosity had replaced laughter. Questions filled the air. Was she really a veteran? Had she been part of missions that the base hadn't even heard about? Why did the tattoo carry such an air of mystery? Through it all, she remained composed. She didn't argue, didn't justify herself, and didn't need to. Her quiet confidence spoke louder than any words could. The tattoo that had invited mockery now held the power to silence it. Every soldier who looked at her began to sense that this was someone exceptional, someone whose experiences far surpassed what they could comprehend. And while they didn't yet understand the full story, the seeds of respect had begun to take root. By the time the afternoon sun began to dip, the laughter had mostly disappeared. It was replaced by a mixture of curiosity and cautious admiration. Some soldiers still whispered, but now it was in awe rather than ridicule. The tattoo that had once been a source of mockery had transformed into a symbol of intrigue. Everyone watching her could sense that this was not a woman to underestimate. She stood quietly, arms relaxed at her sides, letting the moment unfold around her. She had arrived at the base as an outsider, mocked for her appearance, doubted for her past, and questioned for her choices. But as the day went on, it became clear that she was more than the sum of those doubts. Her tattoo was no longer just a design, it was a statement. And one day everyone would see exactly what it meant. For now, she let them watch, let them whisper, and let them wonder. Because in that silence, in that moment of quiet observation, she knew that her true story was about to unfold, and it would leave no room for mockery or doubt. As the afternoon settled over the naval base, something shifted in the air. The earlier whispers and hidden smirks had quieted into an uneasy silence. Soldiers who had been mocking her tattoo now found themselves stealing glances, trying to understand why it seemed so different, so commanding. The tattoo wasn't just ink. It had an energy, a presence that seemed to ripple out from her forearm. And it wasn't just the design. It was how she carried herself, the way her posture was upright, her movements calm and purposeful, every step precise as though she had rehearsed this moment her whole life. Among the many watching her, there was one figure who didn't comment, didn't laugh, and didn't whisper. A senior officer, passing by, had noticed her presence and her tattoo. His gaze lingered, curious but measured. Unlike the others, he didn't see it as a joke or a rebellious statement. There was a sense of familiarity in the symbols etched on her arm, something that stirred memories buried deep within his own experiences. He didn't say a word. He merely observed, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the intricate lines. He had seen tattoos like this before, but only in rare situations, worn by those who had earned them through experiences most people couldn't even imagine. The soldiers who had been mocking her didn't notice the silent acknowledgement yet. They continued their nervous chatter, not realizing that the senior officer's recognition was significant. Some tried to whisper again, questioning her place at the base, but their words now carried uncertainty. The confidence she exuded made their jokes feel weak, hollow, and pointless. Every glance they threw at her seemed to remind them that she didn't need validation from anyone. She had already earned her place in ways they couldn't understand. She moved with purpose, walking past the training grounds where young recruits were drilling. The tattoo caught the sunlight again, gleaming faintly, drawing more attention than she wanted. Soldiers paused mid-task, some squinting as if the symbols themselves held secrets they couldn't decode. Her forearm told a story she didn't need to speak aloud. To anyone paying attention, it hinted at missions undertaken, challenges faced, and promises kept. For most, it was mysterious, even intimidating. For the few who could recognize its meaning, it was a mark of someone extraordinary. The senior officer finally stepped closer, his eyes now fixed on the tattoo. There was something about the design that triggered a memory he had long thought buried. His expression changed subtly, moving from curiosity to recognition, though he kept his composure. This wasn't something he could share openly. The tattoo carried meanings known only to a select few, symbols reserved for people who had been through certain experiences. And now, in front of him, was someone wearing it with quiet authority, as if daring anyone to question her. Meanwhile, the other soldiers around her were beginning to notice the shift in atmosphere. The confident gaze of the senior officer made them pause, and slowly, the teasing words that had been floating in the air died out. The realization began to creep in. This was not an ordinary newcomer. There was a story here, a history that they could sense but not yet understand. Some tried to make light of it, but their attempts were weak, faltering. They glanced nervously at the officer, then back at her, unsure how to act. She walked with measured steps toward the central courtyard, observing the reactions around her. She could feel the tension, the curiosity, and the growing respect. None of it was overt, but it was there, quiet yet undeniable. The base, which had seemed ordinary and predictable a few hours ago, now felt charged with anticipation. Something about her tattoo, her demeanor, and the way the senior officer was observing her had shifted the mood. Everyone was waiting, even if they didn't know what for. As she paused briefly near a row of vehicles, the officer stepped forward slightly, closing the distance just enough to keep his attention on her without making it obvious. There was a silent understanding forming, though she hadn't spoken a word. He didn't need her to explain. The tattoo already told him enough. Each symbol on her arm carried meaning, dangerous missions, critical operations, and moments of bravery that few people could claim. To someone trained to notice such things, it was a code, a map of her accomplishments. The junior soldiers around them began to notice the subtle tension as well. They saw how the officer's posture had shifted, how his gaze held something deeper than mere curiosity. Whispers started again, but this time, there was awe mingled with the uncertainty. "Do you see that?" one muttered quietly. He's looking at her like she's important." Another nodded slowly. "That tattoo isn't just ink. There's something about it, something we don't understand." She didn't react to the stares or whispers. Her calmness never wavered, and in fact, it seemed to amplify her presence. She had walked into this base knowing the challenges ahead, knowing that doubt and mockery would greet her. And now, she could see that the first signs of recognition were appearing. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but it was happening. The tattoo that had made people laugh was beginning to command attention. The day wore on, and the sunlight shifted across the courtyard, highlighting the tattoo's details in a new light. The senior officer didn't break eye contact, silently acknowledging what the others could not. Slowly, an invisible line was being drawn between those who mocked and those who could recognize true skill, bravery, and experience. The realization was dawning that this woman was not someone to underestimate. She had walked into the base as a stranger, but she was leaving a mark far deeper than the ink on her arm. By the end of the afternoon, the atmosphere had changed. The whispers were quieter, more respectful, and tinged with curiosity instead of ridicule. The tattoo was no longer just a design. It was a signal, a message that only the observant could read. And the senior officer, who had recognized its meaning, was preparing silently for the moment when the rest of the base would understand the truth. By late afternoon, the naval base had grown quieter. The earlier chatter and whispers had mostly died down, replaced by a tense anticipation that nobody could quite explain. Soldiers who had initially mocked her tattoo now observed her with curiosity, trying to understand why one simple design on her forearm seemed to command such attention. It wasn't just the tattoo itself. It was the way she carried herself, the quiet confidence in her every movement, the calm authority in her gaze. Then, the unmistakable sound of approaching boots echoed through the base. Conversations stopped immediately. Soldiers instinctively straightened, snapping to attention. A senior figure was entering, someone whose presence alone demanded respect. The base commander, a decorated general known for his sharp eye, unwavering discipline, and decades of experience. His reputation preceded him, and the air seemed to thicken with tension as he approached. The general moved with precise authority, scanning the area with a practiced, observant gaze. As he passed by the rows of soldiers, there was a ripple of silence. Even the most confident juniors found themselves shrinking under the weight of his presence. He had seen countless soldiers, evaluated hundreds of newcomers, and yet, when his eyes fell on her, something changed. His usual measured composure faltered for the briefest moment. He stopped in his tracks, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The tattoo on her forearm caught his eye, glinting faintly in the late afternoon sun. At first glance, it seemed like any other detailed design, but the general's experienced eyes immediately recognized its significance. The symbols, the patterns, the placement, all of it screamed familiarity. It wasn't just a mark of decoration. It was a mark of someone who had been through rare and extraordinary experiences, someone who had operated in missions only a select few could ever imagine. The soldiers around her sensed the shift instantly. The whispers of curiosity became hushed gasps as they noticed the general's reaction. Some exchanged nervous glances, unable to understand what was happening. Why was a figure as authoritative as the general so visibly affected by a simple tattoo? Their earlier assumptions, the jokes, and the mockery now seemed petty and foolish. The moment was electric, charged with recognition that nobody outside a select circle could fully comprehend. The general walked directly toward her, his boots echoing loudly on the concrete floor. Every step he took seemed deliberate, purposeful, and commanding. The closer he came, the more the soldier's curiosity and tension grew. The general's gaze was fixed on her tattoo, scanning it like a code only he could read. The atmosphere around her was no longer filled with doubt or mockery. Instead, there was awe. Every soldier who had watched her throughout the day could feel that this moment was about to reveal something extraordinary. She remained perfectly calm. Her posture was straight, her expression neutral, but inside, a quiet anticipation coursed through her. She had prepared for this moment her entire life. She had known that someday, someone with the knowledge and experience to read her tattoo would recognize its significance. Today, that person had arrived. And now, she stood ready to face the recognition she had long awaited. The general stopped a few feet away and studied her forearm closely. He didn't speak immediately. The silence stretched, tense and heavy, as if the entire base were holding its breath. Every soldier present instinctively understood that this was not just a routine inspection or a casual glance. This was a moment of revelation. The tattoo, once a source of curiosity and ridicule, had become a symbol of something far greater, an unspoken acknowledgement of courage, service, and accomplishment that only a few could recognize. Then, in a voice that was calm but carried immense weight, the general spoke. "Ma'am," he said, his tone quiet but commanding, "welcome back." The words hung in the air, echoing softly through the courtyard. Every soldier froze. The juniors who had laughed at her earlier couldn't comprehend the full meaning of his statement. But even without understanding, they felt the gravity of it. The general's recognition had transformed her from a newcomer with a mysterious tattoo into someone extraordinary, someone whose past deeds demanded respect. The reaction around her was immediate. Soldiers who had previously mocked her now looked on with newfound awe. Eyes widened, jaws slackened, and murmurs of astonishment spread through the crowd. The tattoo that had once invited ridicule now spoke louder than any words could. It told a story of experience, bravery, and service that very few could claim. The general's acknowledgement had shifted the atmosphere entirely, turning doubt into respect and curiosity into admiration. For her part, she remained composed, returning the general's gaze with steady eyes. There was no need for explanation. The tattoo had already done its work. The recognition, the respect, and the acknowledgement were all communicated silently, powerfully, and clearly. She had walked onto the base a stranger, mocked and questioned, and yet now, in that single moment, she had established her place. The general's words had validated not only her presence but her history, her sacrifices, and her achievements. Around them, the base seemed to hum with a new energy. Soldiers who had been unsure of how to react now watched with quiet respect. They realized that the woman standing before them was no ordinary soldier. The tattoo, once an object of ridicule, had become a symbol of hidden valor, a secret history now partially revealed by the most authoritative figure on the base. The general's acknowledgement had silently communicated what the others could not yet see. She had earned her place, and her story was one that demanded attention. The moment stretched for several seconds, long enough for every soldier present to feel its weight. The general saluted her, a gesture loaded with honor and recognition. She returned it standing tall, calm, and composed. In that silent exchange, a story of courage, experience, and respect was told more powerfully than any words could convey. The mockery of the morning was now a distant memory, replaced entirely by awe, curiosity, and admiration. And as the general stepped back, giving her a respectful nod, the soldiers around them began to understand that this was more than just a tattoo or a newcomer. This was a hero, recognized by someone who knew the significance of every mark, every symbol, every experience she carried with her. The moment was quiet, yet monumental, a turning point that would be remembered by everyone present. The general's words, simple as they were, hung in the air like a powerful echo. "Welcome back, ma'am." For most of the soldiers present, it was just a phrase. For her, and for the few who could recognize the meaning behind her tattoo, it carried the weight of recognition, respect, and history. The laughter and mockery that had followed her earlier that morning dissolved instantly, replaced by a quiet awe. Eyes widened, whispers ceased, and the soldiers who had doubted her earlier couldn't help but stare in amazement. The tattoo on her forearm, once a curiosity, now seemed alive with meaning. Every intricate line, every symbol etched into her skin represented missions, challenges, and experiences few could ever imagine. To the casual eye, it was just a design. To the observant, it was a chronicle of courage and skill. And now, with the general's acknowledgement, it had become a silent testament to her accomplishments. The soldiers around her began to realize that they were in the presence of someone extraordinary. Someone whose past actions had earned the highest respect of those in command. The general, standing just a few feet away, looked at her with a mixture of admiration and solemnity. His gaze lingered, not just on the tattoo, but on her posture, her calm expression, and the quiet strength she carried in every movement. He had seen countless soldiers in his career, and yet something about her presence, combined with that unique tattoo, commanded his full attention. It wasn't just recognition of skill. It was recognition of a story that most people would never know, a story written in actions, risks, and sacrifice. As she returned his gaze with steady eyes, the soldiers around them began to whisper among themselves. "Do you see that?" one murmured. "He's not just looking at her. He's acknowledging her history, her missions." Another added, "That tattoo, it's not just a mark. It's a story, and he knows it." Slowly, the realization spread. The woman who had arrived that morning as an outsider, mocked for her tattoo, was now being recognized by one of the most powerful figures on the base. Her status had shifted instantly, silently, and irrevocably. Her mind briefly drifted to the missions she had completed, the operations that had tested her courage and skill. Each symbol on her tattoo was a reminder of those moments. The dangerous assignments where failure was not an option, the time she had saved lives in impossible conditions, and the countless hours of preparation and discipline that had led her to this point. Every mark on her arm told a story of perseverance, bravery, and commitment, stories that had remained hidden from most of the world. And now, the general's recognition was the first public acknowledgement of that silent history. The soldiers who had mocked her earlier now looked on in quiet amazement. They had expected arrogance, drama, or excuses. Instead, they saw calm confidence and quiet dignity. No words were needed. Her actions, her demeanor, and her tattoo spoke for her. They realized that the woman they had underestimated was someone who had earned her place through experience and valor. And more than that, they sensed that her story was far bigger than anything they could have imagined. As the moment stretched, the general spoke again, his voice low but firm. "You've served with distinction," he said, almost to himself, yet loud enough for the attentive soldiers to hear. "Your sacrifices, your courage, they are recognized." The words carried the weight of authority, and the soldiers felt it. They understood now that this wasn't just a newcomer or a soldier with an unusual tattoo. This was a veteran, a hero, someone whose past deeds had earned the highest respect. For her, the recognition was both powerful and quiet. She didn't need applause or congratulations. The acknowledgement in the general's eyes, the subtle nod of respect, and the hushed attention of the soldiers around her were enough. It validated every risk she had taken, every challenge she had faced, and every decision she had made in the line of duty. Her tattoo, which had once invited ridicule, now represented honor, experience, and legacy. Slowly, the soldiers began to understand the significance of her presence. The whispers turned into careful conversations. The curious stares softened into admiration. Even those who had doubted her initially began to show subtle signs of respect, nodding slightly as she passed, stepping aside to let her move freely, and recognizing, in small ways, the history she carried with her. Her story, once invisible, was now beginning to make itself known, not through words, but through acknowledgement, presence, and the symbols etched on her arm. As the general stepped back slightly, the energy around her shifted completely. The tension, the curiosity, and even the lingering doubt had transformed into something else entirely: respect. The soldiers now saw her not as a stranger, but as someone extraordinary, someone whose past actions had left an indelible mark on the very fabric of their military world. The tattoo, once a source of mockery, had become a symbol of her true identity, a silent narrative of bravery, skill, and commitment that had finally been recognized. In that moment, she understood something profound. It wasn't the laughter, the whispers, or even the scrutiny that defined her. It was the recognition of those who understood her journey, the acknowledgement of her courage and sacrifices, and the quiet power of the story her tattoo told. She had arrived that morning as an outsider, but now, she stood firmly within the ranks of those who knew her worth. The moment was quiet, but it was monumental. A turning point that marked not just her return to the base, but the recognition of a life lived with courage, purpose, and honor. The quiet recognition she received from the general set the stage for a moment of revelation. As the soldiers around her began to absorb the significance of her presence, the story behind the tattoo slowly began to surface, at least in their minds. While no one had yet heard the full details, the symbols on her forearm were no longer mere decorations or curiosities. They were a map of her past, a chronicle of bravery and sacrifice that few people could ever truly understand. Each mark told a story of missions that had tested her limits, pushed her to the edge, and demanded courage beyond the ordinary. Those who had mocked her earlier could now only watch in silent amazement as the reality of her experience became clear. The tattoo wasn't just art. It was an encoded diary of her service. Every line represented a mission, every symbol a memory of a time when danger was constant, and every pattern a reminder of lives saved or promises fulfilled. Few in the world could read it, and even fewer would know the true depth of what each mark meant. But the general, with his trained eye and vast experience, had recognized it immediately. His acknowledgement confirmed that this was someone extraordinary, someone who had achieved feats that most people could only imagine. Her story began to emerge in fragments, in subtle cues that the soldiers around her slowly pieced together. They learned that she had been part of missions that were so dangerous they were considered almost impossible. Operations that required precision, strategy, and nerves of steel. Times when failure was not an option, when the stakes were life and death, and when courage alone could make the difference between survival and disaster. The tattoo was a record of all of this, a silent testament to her resilience and skill. She had operated in environments where few could follow, where secrecy was paramount, and where recognition was rare. Most of her efforts had been classified, known only to a handful of high-ranking officials and her own team. The tattoo was a rare symbol that conveyed her history without words, a code that only those with knowledge could decode. For the others at the base, it was beginning to feel like a language they were only starting to understand, a language that spoke of bravery, leadership, and sacrifice. The more they realized, the more the atmosphere shifted. Soldiers who had whispered and snickered now looked on with quiet respect. They began to comprehend, at least partially, that this woman had walked through danger in ways they could barely imagine. Her composure, her calm confidence, and the way she moved through the base were reflections of experiences that had honed her into someone capable of extraordinary feats. The tattoo, once a curiosity, had become a symbol of authenticity and honor. As her past missions began to unfold in the minds of those around her, the stories of her bravery seemed almost cinematic. There were moments where she had led teams through hostile territory, missions where every step was calculated, and every decision carried enormous risk. There were times she had faced challenges so extreme that ordinary soldiers would have faltered. The tattoo represented all of this, each element, a silent record of the courage, the sacrifices, and the unyielding determination that had defined her service. The soldiers watched, some in disbelief, as they began to understand that the woman they had initially dismissed as an outsider with a strange tattoo was actually a veteran whose deeds were legendary in their own circles. Her past, encoded in the lines and symbols on her forearm, spoke volumes. And the general's recognition had validated all of it. They could sense it in the way he had looked at her, in the respect he had shown, and in the acknowledgement he had given that was heavier than any official ceremony. It became clear to everyone present that the tattoo was a history lesson, a map of resilience and commitment that went far beyond the ordinary. While her face showed calm composure, inside she carried decades of experiences, each mission leaving its mark not only on her skin but on her mind and soul. She had faced loss, danger, and near impossible odds. The tattoo was her way of carrying those experiences forward, a silent narrative of a life dedicated to service. Even the soldiers who had initially mocked her began to feel a quiet humility. They realized that the assumptions they had made, the laughter they had shared, and the whispers they had exchanged were born out of ignorance. They had judged her based on appearances alone, unaware that the symbols on her arm told a story of courage, resilience, and unmatched skill. And now, seeing the general's acknowledgement and hearing fragments of her story, they began to understand that respect was not something earned overnight. It was something proven through action, something that could be silently recorded in a tattoo and instantly recognized by those who understood its significance. By the time the afternoon sun began to fade, the atmosphere around her had transformed completely. The mockery had vanished. What remained was respect, awe, and a quiet curiosity that demanded understanding. Every soldier who looked at her tattoo felt a connection to a history they had only begun to comprehend. They realized that this was more than a woman with a mysterious tattoo. This was a hero, someone whose past actions and sacrifices were written in ink on her arm, visible to anyone who knew how to read it, invisible to those who could not. In that moment, the significance of her tattoo was fully clear. It wasn't about vanity, rebellion, or attention. It was about history, courage, and identity. It was a story of missions completed, challenges faced, and resilience proven. And most importantly, it was a silent signal to those who could recognize it, a mark of honor and legitimacy that demanded acknowledgement. The soldiers around her now understood that the woman standing before them had lived a life few could imagine, and that the tattoo on her forearm was a permanent record of that extraordinary journey. The transformation in the base was complete. What had started as curiosity and skepticism had now grown into silent admiration. The soldiers who had mocked her earlier could no longer deny the presence of someone truly extraordinary. The tattoo that had once been a source of jokes and whispers had become a symbol of respect, a mark of accomplishment that could not be ignored. It told a story of courage, resilience, and sacrifice. A story that was beginning to unfold before everyone's eyes. As the whispers faded, the narrative of her past started to take shape. The general's acknowledgement had acted as a catalyst, prompting those who were paying attention to piece together the fragments of her history. They learned, in broad strokes at first, that she had faced situations that demanded extraordinary bravery. She had operated in environments where failure was not an option, where split-second decisions determined life or death. These were missions that only the most highly trained individuals could attempt, and even fewer could complete successfully. Her tattoo, once mocked for its unusual symbols, now represented the proof of these accomplishments. Stories of her past actions began circulating quietly among the soldiers. They spoke of daring operations in hostile territories, missions where the odds were stacked overwhelmingly against her and her team. They heard whispers of nights spent in enemy territory, of careful strategies executed under immense pressure, and of moments where she had saved lives at great personal risk. Each symbol on her tattoo corresponded to these events, a permanent record etched into her skin that few could understand but all could respect once its significance became known. The junior soldiers, who had initially sneered and whispered, now exchanged glances filled with awe. They realized they had underestimated someone they thought was just a newcomer. Their earlier laughter seemed almost shameful in hindsight. They could see now that the tattoo was not an attempt to attract attention, but a silent testament to her experience and courage. The deeper meaning was clear. She had earned every line, every mark, and every symbol through actions that most people could only imagine. The senior soldiers also felt a shift in their perception. The recognition by the general had validated what they were beginning to sense instinctively. Her calm demeanor, her composed movements, and the quiet authority she carried were all reflections of a life filled with discipline, training, and perilous missions. The tattoo was no longer a curiosity or a point of discussion. It was a declaration, a history lesson in silence. They began to understand that she had not come to the base to seek approval or recognition. She had come simply to fulfill her duties as she always had. Even as respect spread, there was a sense of vindication building within the woman herself. The moments of ridicule from earlier had no power over her now. They had been brief, superficial, and temporary, compared to the lifelong experiences her tattoo represented. Every glance, every whisper, every judgmental remark she had endured faded in the light of the recognition she now received. The acknowledgement from the general had made it clear that her efforts, sacrifices, and history were respected, and that the truth of her courage could not be denied. As she moved through the base, the atmosphere had changed completely. Soldiers who had once avoided her or sneered now stepped aside respectfully, nodded in quiet acknowledgement, or offered a small smile of recognition. The dynamic had shifted entirely. What had been doubt and mockery had transformed into a collective understanding of her abilities and her history. The tattoo, the symbol that had initially drawn ridicule, had become a badge of honor, a sign of legitimacy, and a testament to a life of service. Her presence also seemed to inspire reflection among those around her. The junior soldiers began to understand that respect was not given lightly. It was earned through actions, discipline, and courage. They realized that appearances could be deceiving, and that those who achieved greatness often carried silent symbols of their experiences. The tattoo was a visual cue, a narrative etched in permanence, that told the story of her journey far more eloquently than words could. Meanwhile, the general's gaze remained a steady reminder of validation. The silent acknowledgement of her accomplishments, combined with his reputation and authority, had cemented the soldier's understanding. She was not just a veteran with a tattoo. She was a decorated, experienced, and courageous member of the service. The narrative of her life, previously hidden in symbols and secrecy, was now recognized, honored, and understood, at least in part, by those who had once doubted her. The moment of vindication reached its peak as the soldiers began to quietly discuss her accomplishments among themselves. They spoke of the risks she had taken, the missions she had completed, and the discipline she had maintained under extreme conditions. Even without full details, the recognition of her courage and skill was evident. What had once seemed like a strange tattoo was now understood as a map of bravery, a story written on skin, and a permanent symbol of respect. By the time evening approached, the mood at the base had completely transformed. The laughter, judgment, and mockery of the morning were replaced by a quiet reverence and a deep sense of admiration. Her tattoo, once a target of ridicule, had revealed the truth of her experiences and had commanded respect from everyone present. She had walked into the base as a stranger, doubted and mocked, and yet, by the end of the day, she stood as someone fully vindicated, respected, acknowledged, and silently celebrated by those who had once questioned her. In that moment, it became clear to everyone present that her worth was not measured by appearances or rumors, but by the courage, skill, and resilience she had demonstrated throughout her life. The tattoo was not just ink. It was a story, a record of service, and a symbol of her extraordinary journey. And for the soldiers at the base, the lesson was clear. True courage and experience are recognized not by words, but by actions and by the respect of those who know the story. By the time evening settled over the naval base, A quiet tension had replaced the murmurs and laughter of earlier hours. Soldiers who had once whispered and snickered were now observing her with newfound respect, their eyes reflecting both curiosity and awe. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, as if everyone knew that something extraordinary was about to unfold. The woman who had walked onto the base that morning, her forearm tattoo a source of ridicule, was now commanding attention without a word, her presence alone speaking volumes about who she was. The general, standing a few steps away, had become the focal point of the soldier's awareness. His gaze remained fixed on her tattoo, as if reading a story only he could understand. He had recognized the symbols immediately. The intricate lines, the hidden meanings, the silent record of courage and service. To him, she was no longer a newcomer or a stranger. She was a veteran, a hero whose actions had earned respect that went far beyond rank or ceremony. And now, it was time for that recognition to be made official, for the acknowledgement of her past to resonate throughout the base. Slowly, deliberately, the general brought his hand to his forehead in a salute, a gesture that carried more weight than words ever could. The motion was precise, disciplined, and full of meaning. In that instant, the soldiers around them collectively held their breath, sensing the gravity of the moment. This was not a routine greeting or a casual gesture. This was a public acknowledgement of someone's courage, dedication, and extraordinary history. The general's salute was an unspoken declaration. This woman had earned her place, her respect, and her recognition. She returned the salute, standing tall and composed. Her movements were steady, her posture unwavering, and her expression calm, but inside, she felt a quiet satisfaction. The salute was more than a formality. It was validation of everything she had endured, every mission she had completed, every risk she had taken. It was a moment that erased doubt, silenced mockery, and solidified her place among those who understood true bravery. The soldiers around them watched in awe. Those who had questioned her earlier could no longer find words to mock or belittle. Their eyes followed the exchange, realizing that they were witnessing the culmination of a life filled with courage and discipline. The tattoo that had once been the subject of laughter was now the symbol of her achievements, the visual proof of experiences that few could even imagine. Every line, every mark, and every symbol on her forearm told a story of perseverance, sacrifice, and skill. As the salute ended, the general stepped back slightly, his expression still one of respect and recognition. The moment lingered in the air, heavy with significance. For the soldiers at the base, it was clear that they had been in the presence of someone extraordinary. The initial assumptions, the jokes, and the whispers of ridicule had been completely replaced by admiration and reverence. They had witnessed a transformation not in her, but in their own understanding of what true courage and experience looked like. She lowered her hand from the salute, maintaining her calm demeanor. There was no boastfulness, no need to speak, because her actions and the recognition she had received said everything that words could not. The general's acknowledgement had spoken volumes. It validated her history, her skill, and her contributions. The tattoo, which had once invited ridicule, had become the emblem of her identity, her story, and her honor. Every soldier present could see that she was not just a veteran. They could see that she was someone whose courage and dedication demanded respect. Slowly, murmurs of understanding and admiration began to ripple through the crowd. Soldiers exchanged glances, nodding in acknowledgement, and some even offered quiet words of respect. The young recruits, in particular, seemed to grasp the lesson behind the moment. True recognition is earned through action, perseverance, and bravery, not appearances or words. The woman before them had exemplified this in every step she had taken and in every mark she bore on her arm. The general's presence, combined with her silent authority, created a lasting impact. The base, which had been filled with doubt and mockery just hours before, now buzzed with quiet admiration. The soldiers realized that the woman's story, her experiences, and the symbols on her tattoo were lessons in resilience, courage, and integrity. They understood that mockery could never diminish someone who had earned respect through real achievements, and that recognition from those who understood true skill and bravery was far more meaningful than any superficial judgment. As evening fell, the light highlighted her tattoo one last time, casting faint shadows that seemed to give life to the symbols etched into her skin. Each line, each mark, each symbol glowed with meaning, reflecting a history that was now honored, understood, and respected by everyone present. The general had saluted her, the soldiers had acknowledged her, and the doubts of the morning had completely vanished. She had walked onto the base a stranger, questioned and mocked, and now she stood recognized, respected and vindicated. A hero in the eyes of all who witnessed the moment. In the final moments of the day, as the soldiers returned to their duties, there was a lingering sense of awe. Her presence, her history, and the tattoo that had once drawn ridicule had left an indelible impression. The story of her courage, service, and skill would be remembered, not just for the missions she had completed, but for the quiet dignity with which she carried herself and the respect she had earned. She had proven, without a word, that true honor and recognition come from deeds, not appearances, and that sometimes, the most extraordinary stories are written silently on the skin of those who live them. And so, the base returned to its normal rhythm, but the memory of the salute, the recognition, and the woman with the extraordinary tattoo lingered in every soldier's mind. It was a lesson in respect, a story of courage, and a reminder that appearances could never define true greatness. Her journey had reached a moment of vindication, and her presence had forever left a mark on the hearts and minds of everyone who had witnessed it.